There is a dimension beyond the world you know, a dimension of imagination, of shadows and paradox, perched between the known and the unknowable, a place where ordinary lives unravel into the extraordinary, and every familiar face hides a twist of fate. Tonight you're crossing the threshold into the unexpected, the uncanny, and the inexplicable. Your next stop, the Twilight Zone, here on Things Visible and Invisible. Mark Scott Zicree is an American science fiction author, television writer, producer, and also just happens to be the foremost expert on the Twilight Zone, best known for writing the definitive reference book on the original series entitled The Twilight Zone Companion. And he joins me down the line from where else but Hollywood. Mark, welcome to Things Visible and Invisible.
Thank you, Seán. Glad to be here.
Now, Mark, it's at least 60, 70 years since the Twilight Zone appeared on our screens. Is there anybody still watching it these days?
Yes, millions of people around the world, more than ever before.
Excellent. Well, I'm one of them. I discovered it about 30 years ago, maybe more, 40 years ago, and I was absolutely enthralled by it. It is a series which, like the classic series, like the Star Treks and so on, that just keep giving. It's the gift that keeps giving in a televisual sense. But let's go back to the start of this. You are the expert on this series, and I'm delighted to be speaking to you, Mark. So let's begin with how it came about, because we might need to set the picture for some of the younger people in the audience. American television wasn't filled with Twilight Zones when it first appeared, was it?
No, there was nothing like it on the air prior to Rod Serling creating it. And it was a very interesting occurrence because he was actually the most successful writer in television, writing very reality-based, heavy dramas. But it was during the 1950s, and so anytime he wanted to write about race or politics, the censors would take out all the meaning from his scripts. And he was a very frustrated man because these were certainly times filled with things that writers would want to talk about. And it occurred to Rod that if he put it into a science fictional context, that he could say exactly what he wanted to say about mob hysteria and racism and all of these things. And yet the censors would, because he was writing in science fiction, supposedly meaningless, escapist fiction, he could get all of that past the censors. And that's exactly what happened. So it was quite revolutionary.
Well, I think we better speak about Rod Serling, the man who was the brains, the writer, the creator of this series, because he had lived quite an interesting life before he ever rocked up at Hollywood.
Yes, he grew up in upstate New York, and the day he graduated high school, he signed up for the paratroopers in World War II. So he was, as a teenager, essentially, he was jumping out of airplanes into jungles filled with people trying to kill him. And in fact, at one point, a soldier, Japanese soldier, jumped out right in front of him, his rifle aimed right at Rod. And Rod thought, this is the end of my life. This is the moment that I die. And Rod wasn't aware that there was another American soldier behind him who killed the Japanese soldier in the nick of time. Otherwise, none of us would be talking about the Twilight Zone. But Rod came back from the war at the end of the war, and like so many soldiers, he had PTSD. And to find some way to cope with it, he turned to writing. And so he started selling scripts to radio shows at the time, and television in the States was just emerging as a medium. And he was very early into that medium, and was writing spectacular work even throughout the 50s. But again, anytime it became political or social or controversial, he would be silenced. And so, despite the fact that he was the most lauded and financially successful writer working in the medium, that was not enough for him. He needed to say what he wanted to say.
Now, when he decided to be a writer in the 1940s, the end of the 40s, early 50s,
Yes.
there were many
Yes.
options for him. uh, you know, novel writing was still quite fashionable. There was paperbacks
Yes.
and pulp fiction was still being produced. There was, of course, the allure of Hollywood and becoming a screenwriter for the big screen. What was it about
Yes.
television, which was still then a very nascent media entity?
Well,
What was it about television that you think sort of attracted him at that point?
well, I think there was an immediacy to it. We're talking about live television, and so you would write a script, and millions of people around the country would be seeing it in the moment that it was being performed. The idea initially, a lot of these young writers, and they were all in their 20s pretty much, and the idea was to create a Broadway stage for the entire nation. That was the aspiration that Rod and Patty Chayefsky and a number of the other writers had. And over the course of that decade of the 1950s, it changed. The aspiration became very clear what the reality was going to be, that it was going to be heavily censored. This is during the time of the blacklist. America became very repressive for many writers. And so writers were forced to find alternatives to get the word out. For Patty Chayefsky, he left television and he went to write for the movies and for the stage. But Rod found his ways of staying in the medium that he loved. And by then, of course, the economics had changed to where it was no longer live television; it was filmed, and so that they could rerun it and maximize profits. So by then he moved to Los Angeles, where filmed television was being made. New York had been the hub for live television, and he was really basically, it used to be the producers ran television and were over the writers. Rod was the first what are called showrunners today, which is the writers who run the show, the Vince Gilligans and David Chases and you name it. I mean, every major drama or comedy in the United States, the writers are at the top of the food chain, and that's incredible power. And Rod was really the first to do that, and he was the inspiration for the entire generation of writers who are now running television drama and comedy.
I mean, was there a sense of, I know a lot of his writings, and we're going to get to that in the Twilight Zone, had a sort of
Mm,
futuristic or a visionary aspect to it. Do you think there
yes,
was an element whereby, Rod Serling as a media entity was able to see the power of television, which
yes.
was still then something which was still forming and storming? But do you think he was aware that this was the medium for the future?
Yes, very much so. There was a power to television, and I'm speaking also as someone who's written for television for almost 50 years. I have hundreds of hours of television that I've written and produced, and now I'm directing as well. And it's an incredible medium because it combines basically all the art forms that you would get in cinema, but more than that, it comes into people's houses. And so they don't have to decide to go buy a ticket. They don't have to get in the car and hire a babysitter or any of those things. So there's a great quality of it coming into their homes, being much more intimate in a certain way than movies might be. And Rod, of course, had 39 episodes a year or whatever. Big. Now you'll have a series that might be 6 hours or 8 hours. Rod had an enormous number of stories he could tell over the 5 years that Twilight Zone ran, and over the 5 years, they made 156 episodes, and Rod wrote 92 of them himself, which is an astonishing output. And they were of incredible variety. And because he was such a terrific writer, he was able to attract wonderful actors, wonderful directors. Even Bernard Herrmann, who wrote the score for Citizen Kane and Psycho and Taxi Driver, he scored a number of Twilight Zone episodes, and brilliantly.
Absolutely. We're going to get into that, but I'm still curious about how this came about, Mark. And one other question is,
Yes.
because you've talked about the immediacy and the intimacy of television, certainly
Mhm.
by the 1950s and so on. However,
Yes.
before that, radio had been king in
Yes.
both sides of the Atlantic. And radio dramas were very, very popular. And as we both
Yes.
know, there was a really rich subset of radio dramas that dealt with similar type of subject matter to the Twilight
Yes.
Zone. There were hauntings
Yes.
or scary tales, like Suspense, for
Right.
example, is one of the
Well,
great.
there's Art Chobler with Lights Out, or
Exactly,
and
Lights
Norman
Out,
Norman
Suspense, and so on.
exactly, yes,
So was Serling influenced by that? Do you think? I mean, was he a
yes,
devotee of that?
very much so. And Norman Corwin was probably the greatest writer working in dramatic radio. Norman Corwin wrote On a Note of Triumph at the end of World War II, which was a spectacular radio play. Essentially, you hadn't arrived until you had acted as an actor in one of Norman's works, and so he had Orson Welles and all the great actors. And Norman actually was a friend of mine, and he was Serling's idol. So Norman Corwin of radio was the guy that Serling was modeling himself after, because Norman would have an entire show. It'd be like 13 by Corwin, where it'd be 13 radio plays, one per week, written by this one writer. And it was a very specific voice. Norman was very politically active and also a wonderful writer. So and later in life, of course, when Rod came out to Hollywood, he got to know Norman Corwin directly. But there's very much a a tradition of mentorship in writing, and so definitely Norman Corwin was an influence, and Ray Bradbury, of course, was a huge influence, and they also knew each other. And Rod ended up hiring three of Ray's proteges to be the other major writers on Twilight Zone. So it was Charles Beaumont, Richard Matheson, and George Clayton Johnson. And because he called Ray and he said, like, listen, we've been trying to find writers for this show, and the submissions we're getting are terrible. Well, what should I do? And Ray said, come over to the house and we'll talk. And he took Rod Serling into his basement where his office was, and he pulled out four books. One was by John Collier, a British writer, and one was by Richard Matheson, one was by Charles Beaumont, and one was by Ray himself. And he said, read these and let's talk. And so Rod ended up doing an adaptation of a Collier story called The Chaser, and then he hired Beaumont and Matheson and George Clayton Johnson to write episodes, and they were spectacular.
So another question that comes to mind, Mark, is obviously Hollywood, or sorry, the sort of Hollywood television world of the 1950s United States, as you've said, was quite constricted in ways, constricted politically and so on. A series like The Twilight Zone would have been very much left field, putting it mildly. How did Rod Serling convince the money man in Hollywood that this was a good proposition?
It was very challenging. He actually, if you're really determined to accomplish something revolutionary, you often have to be made of steel. You have to be the drop of water that wears down the mountain. And Rod actually ended up writing four pilot scripts for Twilight Zone before the show got greenlit, before it got approved as a series. And so the first script that Rod wrote was called The Time Element, and it was about a man going back in time to Pearl Harbor to try to avert the Japanese attack. And they read it and they shelved it. They didn't decide they weren't going to make it. And another producer on another show who couldn't afford Rod's normal fee heard about this script that was just sort of sitting unmade, and he bought it for his show, which was Desilu Playhouse. It was a show that would be one week out of the month. It would be an hour-long I Love Lucy episode, and then the other 3 weeks it would be a drama or a comedy. It was an anthology, and so they aired that. They made that episode with William Bendix, a movie actor, and it got the biggest rating of the entire season and the biggest male draw. And based on that, CBS said, well, let's hire Rod to write another pilot for Twilight Zone. Let's see if we can. And so Rod wrote another script called The Happy Place about a dystopic future society where when you hit 60, you're sent to an idyllic retirement home called The Happy Place where you're exterminated. And CBS read that script and said, are you out of your mind? And they said, no. And so then Rod, still ever determined, wrote a third pilot script for Twilight Zone, which was called I Shot an Arrow into the Air, which is not the same as the episode of that title that's on the show. Totally different episode about an alien coming to Earth, and essentially it was a Christ allegory where he tries to bring a cure for cancer, and he ends up killed by fearful people. And they said no to that. So Rod, now these were all our scripts, and finally Rod said, okay. What he was doing was course correcting to see what would get past these executives, because he knew there was an audience for science fiction and fantasy and horror, but these executives were not science fiction fans, so they were not understanding what he was doing. So he finally decided he would write a half-hour script about a man who wanders an empty town, doesn't remember who he is, and then suddenly he wakes up and he's an astronaut trainee in an isolation experiment who's basically fantasized the whole storyline. And so it's not actually even a fantasy story. Really, it has a prosaic, reality-based ending. But that was earthbound enough, literally, to get greenlit for the pilot of Twilight Zone. It was an episode called "Where Is Everybody," and it starred Earl Holliman, and that got the show greenlit, and they ordered the series. But Rod turned down. He walked off $1 million contract to write movies. He got out of that contract with MGM to run Twilight Zone. He said, "I may be taking an enormous financial loss, but I have faith in this show, and I'm going to go for it." And no one quite understood what he was going to do, and then he started making episode after episode after episode, and he was in charge of the show. He was the executive producer, essentially.
Was that? I mean, it's a very brave man to walk away from that amount of
Yes.
money in Hollywood as well. Even in the 1950s, Hollywood film was still seen as the senior, the sort of more respectable part of the media. Television was still
Yes.
finding its feet. So he was not only stepping
Yes.
away from a lot of money, but a lot of prestige, a lot of reputation, etc.
Yes.
Do you think it was about, though, the fact that he wanted to control the artistic vision of what he was doing?
Well, a lot of people get Rod's life story wrong. They think he was a tragic figure who was destroyed in the end by his need for money and fame, and it's not true at all. It's nonsense. First and foremost, he was a writer, and he'd get up every morning. He'd write. He was trying to make work that was meaningful. He wanted to be the Arthur Miller of television. That was his initial. He never intended to be a science fiction writer, and he never intended to be a TV star. I mean, they went after other narrators, hosts for the show, and Orson Welles was too expensive, and this other guy named Westbrook von Voorhees was wrong for it. He was the original voice on the first version of the pilot. And finally, Rod said, "Well, how about me?" And they all kind of fell out of their chair laughing. Okay, we'll give it a shot. And of course, it turned out to be he was perfect as the host of the show, and it made a whole secondary career for him as a narrator and voiceover person. And but as much as that paid very very lucratively, in his mind and in his soul, he was a writer, and he was always facing the blank page essentially, and trying to make magic.
Do you think there was a part of him that sort of, because we probably both know that in the world of film, creating a film can take years. And for a
Yes.
writer, it can be absolutely soul destroying how a script constantly keeps changing. Do you think there was an element
Yes.
whereby, and you've alluded to it already, Mark, that the immediacy and the control would have helped convince Rod that this was the place for him at this time?
Yes, Rod wrote some movies like Seven Days in May, which is a very good movie with Kirk Douglas and Burt Lancaster, but television was his medium. And because he came up in anthology television, there were many, many anthologies on the air, half-hour anthologies, hour anthologies, 90-minute anthologies like Playhouse 90. And so he was very adept at writing quickly and well. And and around 1956, when he could afford it, 1956, 57, as his career grew, he was able to change from writing on a typewriter to dictating into a recorder, and then having his secretary type it up, and then he'd make hand corrections. So he would lounge by his Olympic-sized swimming pool in Pacific Palisades here in Los Angeles, and dictate the script, and he'd be playing all the roles and calling all the shots. It's amazing to listen to these recordings. And he used to joke that he was the only writer who could get a tan and write a script at the same time. And but he was remarkable in that way. Richard Matheson told me that once he tried to dictate a script, he said he couldn't do it, and Rod was quite rare in being able to pull that off.
Incredible,
But the, but,
absolutely
the,
incredible.
but I should add also, Sean, that the speed of television. First of all, Rod understood that you needed to have power. If you were at the top of the food chain, you could say, "This is how I want it done." And whereas the moment you give away power, then they can do anything they want to your work. And in film, it's still the directors and the producers who run movies, whereas it's writers who run television, and that's thanks to Rod. But because and the speed of it is amazing. I mean, when you think of it, one week he'd be writing a Twilight Zone episode like Walking Distance, and the next week he's writing an episode like The Lonely. These spectacular scripts, week after week after week. It's really an amazing job, and so he was one of a kind, really, truly.
But presumably there was an element which as a writer he would have thrived in that atmosphere, because there's nothing
Yeah.
like a challenge for somebody like Rod Serling, I would imagine, but also
Yes.
something of the variety I mean, it was
Yes.
basically, I mean, from my understanding, you tell me, Mark, that he could come up with whatever he wanted, whatever scenario, you know.
Yes, yes, within budgetary limits, and so but fortunately, they shot Twilight Zone at MGM, which was the great golden age movie studio, and he had access to anything they had ever made or built, and so he had access to every costume, every prop, every set, every backlot building, and so he was shooting on sets on backlot streets that were made for Meet Me in St. Louis and the Andy Hardy films. He was using tons of stuff from Forbidden Planet, which was a big budget science fiction movie that MGM made in the mid 50s. So Robbie the Robot and the flying saucer that was the ship in that movie, and the costumes. I mean, tons of stuff. And I've taken that lesson to heart when I was a producer on a TV show called Sliders at Universal. I said, "Do we have access to everything that Universal has ever made?" And they said, "Well, no one's asked us that question ever before. We don't know. We'll find out." And they came back and they said, "Yes, you can use pretty much everything." So we were using stuff from Jurassic Park and 12 Monkeys and on and on. And that was a lesson I learned from Rod that I'm still utilizing now that I have my own studio. So it's very, very fun because it's really literally Rod had access to an amazing amount of material. So if he said, "Well, I want to do something set in the 19th century," that was easy. He could say, "I wanted to have something set in the 21st century." He that stuff was right there to be utilized. Additionally, William Tuttle, who was one of the greatest makeup men ever, was the makeup guy at MGM. So he was the first makeup man to win an Oscar. He won it for Seven Faces of Dr. Lowe, and he was also, and so Eye of the Beholder, which has this astonishing makeup on the doctors and the nurses. That was because William Tuttle knew how to do it. Or when they did the After Hours, and some of the characters turned out to be mannequins, he was able to fabricate mannequins that looked exactly like the actors that they were supposed to be modeled after. So it's great.
So, what year are we talking when the show first aired?
It debuted in October of 1959, and it ran through 1964 for the 5 seasons. And yeah,
Okay, and talk to me a little bit about the reaction, Mark, both the critical reaction and also the popular reaction.
well, I think young people don't understand what television was like back in the day, because now you can watch anything you want, anytime you want, on your computer, on your big screen TV, on your phone. It's very interesting because those of us who make television shows now have to conceive. We have to make the shot work, whether it's on a 100-inch screen or an 8-inch screen, or it's a 5-inch screen. So you're always cognizant of what will convey. But back then, in America, there were only three television networks: CBS, NBC, and ABC, and so everyone watched everything. So you would have whether or not you were watching every episode of a TV show, you knew what all the shows were, and a rating might be 35, 40 million people on a given night. So Rod was having an enormous audience. And you could only watch a show when they aired it, when they broadcast it. There were no VCRs, no media players, and so you had to be there 10 at night when it aired, and you had to watch it. And then it would go into syndication after its network run, and then you might be able to see it, 5 days a week in the afternoon in syndication. But that was it. And so people really, they were hugely avid fans of the Twilight Zone. And Rod became a TV star. He couldn't go anywhere without being recognized, and that was a mixed bag.
Well, talk to me a little bit about that because one of the things about the Twilight Zone that people don't really realize initially is that Rod is that iconic figure at the start who sets up whatever the premise is.
Yes,
And this wasn't some sort of steered to camera delivery. It was often
no,
done with lots of innovative and creative ideas
yes,
around it, and it is superb to
yes,
watch. But the other
yes,
thing, Mark, that struck me though was this is a writer. This is a man whose background is basically writing and producing, I guess. But
yes,
on camera, he has that quality. You mentioned people like Orson Welles. He has that quality of
yes,
speaking to camera, and you're completely hooked. You're
yes,
completely with him. Wherever he's taking you, you're going with him. Was he
yes,
aware of
100.
just how good he was on camera?
No. No, at first he was very, very nervous. He hadn't acted since high school, like high school theatricals. And so, but fortunately, he had a style and a presence and very quickly it was obvious that he was just born for this, made for this. And by the end of the series, he was very at ease, very comfortable being in front of camera. But it took a while, and often it was the directors who would come up with an interesting way of introducing him visually in a given episode. They would try to come up with different ways to have that work, and but he was iconic, absolutely, and he certainly and his voice was so specific to him, and that was really really lovely. So it was he enjoyed being a star. He really enjoyed being famous and being recognized. His daughters, sometimes he'd be out like Disneyland or somewhere with his daughters, and they would go, "Oh God, really do." They didn't want to share him, but he was always very gracious to people. He'd sign autographs and all of that stuff, and but then he would go back and do the work as well, and he was the real deal. There's so many people in Hollywood who are momentarily adequate. They're like they're famous and they're whatever happened to that person. That wasn't Rod at all. The fact that we're talking about his work all these decades later is because it was brilliant.
Well, you say that, and I completely agree with you, Mark. But there were only a number of seasons. Was it 5 seasons in
Yes,
total?
five.
Um, Today it would have been a 20-year, cycle or whatever it would have been. But like Star Trek, the original Star Trek, people forget how
Yes,
quickly these series came and went. Was
yes,
it
true.
Rod's idea to pull the plug, or was it the networks?
Well, the problem is that there's only three networks. So if you piss off the three guys at the top of those networks, you're out of a career. It's no, it was but see, by the time you got into the 60s, the attitude of the networks had changed, where they wanted shows that had no controversy, that everyone would like. They didn't have to be great, but they had to be soothing, essentially. And they weren't looking for controversy, they weren't looking for brilliance. And so Rod was fighting the tide of the moment. And by the fifth season, he was still creating some phenomenal shows, as were the other writers. I mean, the fifth season has an episode called "In Praise of Pip" that's brilliant, that Rod wrote with that stars Jack Klugman and Billy Mooney. You have the Talkie Tina episode that Charles Beaumont and Jerry Soule wrote with the talking doll. Twilight Zone had not run out of steam at all, but it was canceled, and the fourth season. They actually tried to make it an hour long. They actually did 18-hour long episodes for season four, and it really didn't work, even though Rod had initially envisioned the show as an hour show. It really fit the half hour perfectly. So then on season five, it went back to half hours, but it was canceled. And then Rod had a few meetings with ABC and so forth to try to see if he could get a similar show going. And that he was pitching something called Rod Serling's Witches, Werewolves, and Warlocks, and that didn't get picked up, but eventually that sort of morphed into Night Gallery, which is the show he did after Twilight Zone, which is much more horror oriented. But Rod wasn't running that show, and so he butted heads often with the executive producer in charge of the show, Jack Smite. So he did some great work, Rod Serling, on Night Gallery, but it was not of the quality, the amazing quality that Twilight Zone had accomplished.
Let's talk a little bit, Mark, about the afterlife of the Twilight Zone,
Sure.
because it was a great hit in the late 50s and early 60s on both sides of the
Yeah.
Atlantic.
Yes.
And then, like most things, fashions come and fashions go. It was very much a sort of 60s show, so it disappeared for a while. I know certainly in the UK, it resurfaced late night in the
Yes.
1980s on Channel 4 in this
Yes.
country. And it
Mm.
introduced people like me and a whole generation to something that we knew nothing about. What was this?
Yes.
Did something similar happen in the United States?
No, it actually went into syndication, and it ran continuously, and then it started being aired on holidays as a marathon, the Twilight Zone marathon on Christmas or Thanksgiving or etc. Or January, New Year's Eve, and so it always had popularity. But then it had an even greater popularity once you got home video, and then you started to see a proliferation of Twilight Zone toys, little figures and so forth, but it always sort of maintained that popularity. And it's amazing because it goes against the tide. Everyone says, well, young people won't watch black and white, and yet people love Twilight Zone of all ages. I first knew Twilight Zone was going to last when I have a sister who's 19 years younger than me, and she became a fanatic for the show. And I thought, okay, it's gonna last. And Carol Serling, Rod's widow, and I, we'd get together periodically, and she'd say she was always amazed. She said, "It's amazing. It's still going. It's still popular." And I said, "Yeah, yeah, it is." And I started writing the book when I was 21, 22 years old, and it came out when I was 27, and it's been in print nonstop. And I wrote the book to learn how to write and produce great television. And by the time I was 22 or 23, I was writing for TV shows. And now I have my own studio. I'm making a new show called Space Command that millions of people around the world are watching. So Rod taught me very well, and he taught many of the showrunners. Many of the showrunners read Twilight Zone Companion, and that inspired them to become writer producers in TV. So it's very gratifying. Rod had a ripple effect. So he was one of the top writers of the first golden age of television, and he's responsible as an icon to inspire the second golden age of television. So it's quite remarkable.
Answer me this if you can, Mark, and this is a difficult
Yeah.
question. Um, but what was the? I mean, we're both fans of the Twilight Zone
Yes.
and Rod's work, and will always be, as are many people. However,
Yes.
if I was to ask you what the essence of the Twilight Zone, why it is so compelling, so attractive, so turning people into devotees, why is it? Do you think?
It's because it has, I was going to say, it has meat on the bone. It's not just about the twist ending. It's about the human condition. It's about love, life, death. It explores deeply human, real life issues. In Nothing in the Dark, the great episode by George Clayton Johnson, where an old woman is barricaded in her apartment, fearing that death in some disguise will come and enter her home and take her away. And then when a police officer is shot and wounded outside her door, she has to decide whether she's going to take this enormous risk and bring this young man in who's dying. And it was Robert Redford, amazingly, who played that role. And it was an older British actress named Gladys Cooper who played the old woman. And at the end, she has to accept death, and not as a terrible thing, but as a blessing. And it's an amazing episode. Or Kick the Can, another great episode, or Walking Distance. There's so many of them, and you can know what the twist ending is and watch them over and over and over again, because there's so much. The acting is terrific, the writing is terrific, the music, the direction. I mean, it's the best. I think an argument can be made that it's the best show ever made for television. And certainly, people just love it. I'm amazed that it's spanned all of these generations. I don't think it's going to peter out. I think 100 years from now, I'll be in my third cloned body, and we'll be talking about Twilight Zone still. So I think it's going to continue.
Well, I mean, I just listening to you as you're speaking, Mark, I'm thinking that you've hit the nail on the head. The show never talked down to the audience. If anything, it knew that the audience could take much more than maybe what general television was
Yes,
giving it in terms of
yes,
intellectual inquiry, in terms of speculative thought,
yes,
and also the use of the imagination. It really fired your
yes.
imagination as a show. Um,
Well, that is it. But I wanted to make a point about that, Sean, because I think it is important. There's always been in television a battle between two philosophies. One philosophy is that the audience is as smart and as hungry for meaning and content as we are. But we must never write down to your audience. You must always assume that if you're writing from the heart, it will reach their hearts. The other is that the other philosophy, and often there are executives who have this philosophy, is the audience is stupid, and you must not they don't want the entertainment that we want. They're stupid, and you have to write down to them. I've actually heard heads of networks say this to me personally, and of course, I vehemently disagree with this, as Rod would have. If you give people, you know, lousy food, that's what they're going to get used to. But if you give them good food, they'll enjoy it more. So I agree 100% with Rod.
Absolutely. Now, we both know in the world of entertainment, if something's a success, you can absolutely bet money there'll be an imitator,
Yes,
a counterfeit of some sort coming along. Was that the case with the Twilight
yes.
Zone?
Yes, and they've tried to bring Twilight Zone back a couple, 2, 3 times, and it really hasn't worked as nearly as well. But there are certain shows that are inspired by Twilight Zone, that I think are really really something. I mean, Black Mirror certainly is a child of the Twilight Zone, and Pluribus, Vince Gilligan's new show, has many many references to Twilight Zone in it. And Vince is. I recently had a long conversation with Vince. I have a YouTube channel now called Mr. Sci-Fi, where I post about Twilight Zone and about the shows that I'm shooting now. And we had an hour-long talk with Vince Gilligan on my channel, Mr. Sci-Fi, just talking about Twilight Zone and its influence on his work and on the world in general. And so it's and and the meat and the technology is so wonderful now. I produced the Twilight Zone Blu-ray, and I did 52 episode commentaries on that, and on my YouTube channel, I'm constantly talking about Twilight Zone, and these are media that Rod certainly would have embraced were he still here. It would be so much easier for him to make his TV show now than it was back in the 50s and early 60s. So, but he only lived to 50 years old. He died very prematurely, and yet he got so much done in the time he had. So thank God for Rod.
Mark, it's been really fascinating talking to you about Twilight Zone, and I hope you'll come back on this show again at some point. But for now, tell people where they can find out more about you and where they can pick up a copy of your book.
Well, I've just done the new third edition of the Twilight Zone Companion with 100 more pages and 500 new photos and audio and video links to rarities. And that, the Twilight Zone Companion third edition, you can find that on Amazon. And for a lot more content about science fiction, my YouTube channel is Mr. Sci-Fi. That's SCIFI. And Space Command, the first 2 hours of Space Command, our new show, Space Command Redemption, is airing on Google Play and Amazon Prime and Tubi and wherever good science fiction is viewed. So you can find it there.
For now, Mark, thank you so much for coming on Things Visible and Invisible.
Thank you, Seán. It was a true pleasure.
Thank you for joining us on another episode of Things Visible and Invisible. We're dedicated to uncovering phenomena that challenge our understanding of reality, from ancient enigmas and paranormal encounters to scientific anomalies and forgotten histories. If you enjoyed this journey into the mysterious and unexplained, please consider subscribing to our channel and hitting the notification bell to stay updated on future explorations. Have a personal experience or story that aligns with our investigations? We'd love to hear from you. Visit our website at tvi.show and reach out through our contact form. While we can't feature every submission, we review them all, and your story might be featured in an upcoming episode. To support our continued investigations, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter or channel member. Your contributions make these explorations possible and give you access to exclusive content, early releases, and monthly behind-the-scenes discussions with our team. Don't forget to check out our merch store. We've got everything from TVI-branded t-shirts and hoodies to stickers and coffee mugs, perfect for showing your support while keeping the mysteries close. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time as we continue to explore the things visible and invisible.